All right, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being here and for your attention. And I want to welcome you to the second session, Backgrounds and Foregrounds. And our first speaker is Jennifer Chong.
Thank you, Shira. Okay. I want to thank Shira and Caro for convening this exciting set of presentations, and to Steve, Juan, and other Huntington personnel for facilitating our digital gathering today. The title of my talk is Over-Marbling and Paper's Disorderly Metamorphoses. And what I'd like to investigate today is the relationship between order and disorder in the ecology of early modern paper. Flax-based paper has long been recognized as an emblem of an intensive early modern culture of recycling and reuse, but less attention has been paid to the way in which paper's protracted metamorphic existence was structured by alternating phases of order and disorder, of building up and breaking down, of form and matter. By considering paper's many lives from this perspective, I aim to open up a conversation about the aesthetic and material significance of disorder. My entry point into these questions is a form of paper reuse known as overmarbling. Overmarbling is a technique in which sheets of printed waste are marbled or printed with a fluid polychromatic layer that obscures the underlying text. Most of the extant examples are found on American bindings from the early decades of the 19th century, and in particular, bindings commissioned by the Massachusetts printer-publisher Isaiah Thomas. Overmarbling is generally characterized as a form of thrift, a pragmatic and efficient tactic to prevent waste paper from remaining mere waste, what we might today call a form of upcycling. The economic interpretation of overmarbling has been bolstered by the fact that its association with the early American Republic fits smoothly into a narrative about material scarcity in the young nation. Consequently, overmarbled bindings have generally been considered interesting only for the texts that have gradually been revealed as the water-based marbling pigments fade and abrade. And indeed, these are sometimes quite surprising and interesting texts, like John Cleland's erotic novel, Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure. However, when we look at the specific history of marbling in the 18th century Anglo-American world, we can construct another narrative, one in which marbling itself has something to say about the utility, even the promise, of chaos and disorder, in comparison with the regularity and order of type. In contrast with its cultivation as a decorative art in France and Germany, the Islamic art of marbling came to England relatively late and accompanied by much technical mystification. Rather than residing in the artisan's workshop, early British interest in marbling was concentrated among natural philosophers like Robert Boyle and John Evelyn. Even as they admired marbling's decorative appearance, these men were fascinated by marbling as a physico-chemical phenomenon that produces complex, unique, and unstable surfaces. And in keeping with this technical interest, the British sought to put these peculiar marbled surfaces to practical use, in particular, as Jake Benson's research has shown, as a security device on various financial instruments. This technological approach to marbling was extended by early American printers like Benjamin Franklin and Isaiah Thomas, who used marbling in governmental and archival projects where we would expect order and regularity to reign above all. In evaluating overmarbling's significance, it's thus important to note that while Thomas was a thrifty businessman, happy to save a penny where possible, he was also a man with larger ambitions. Most of the overmarbled bindings he commissioned are found on books, including some unique and valuable specimens that form the initial collection of the American Antiquarian Society, an institution founded by Thomas in 1813 with the aim of preserving, quote unquote, all the printed material of early America. What about marbling makes it a suitable means of recycling printed waste sheets? Notably, the vast majority of the over-marbled sheets used by Thomas feature a dark, closely patterned design that is especially well suited to obscuring the underlying text. In this particular pattern, now usually known as Stormont, one of the pigments, indigo in these cases, is mixed with turpentine so that it dissolves into frothy bubbles. The scale of the lacy circles is well matched to the negative spaces defined by printed letters like D or M, further obscuring the printed page by intermixing meaningful form and unmeaning pattern. These similar but different marks are generated by distinct forms of propagation. In contrast to the solid matrix used in letterpress and other conventional print processes, marbling is generated by the unpredictable movements of a fluid surface. To marble a piece of paper, liquid pigments are scattered on the surface of a basin of water that has been slightly thickened with a starch. The movement of these pigments, sometimes augmented by a marbler's stick or comb, generates a complexly patterned surface. To print this ephemeral design, a piece of paper is carefully laid onto the water's surface and then lifted off, effecting a transfer of the thin pigment layer onto the surface of the paper. Each marbled pattern is ultimately determined by the chaotic movement of pigments across the water's undifferentiated and fluid surface. This fluid form making gives marbled papers their vivacity and complexity, and it also gives each sheet a unique and singular pattern. Marbling's chaotic nature was heightened in the Stormont pattern that predominates among overmarbled bindings. To create traditional patterns, like antique straight or bouquet, the marbler uses a comb or a brush to guide the pigments into recognizable designs, as we saw in the video. In contrast, the patterns that became popular in the late 18th and early 19th centuries rely exclusively upon the chemical physical interactions of adulterated pigments. So, adding turpentine to create the lacy pattern of Stormont, or oil to create the overlapping blobs of shell. And in these patterns, the marbler really takes a step back and does not directly or manually interfere with the movement of the pigments on the water surface. Overmarbling's chaotic transformation of the page can be situated within a larger structural alternation between order and disorder, an alternation that enables the circulation of matter within ecosystems. And here I use the word ecosystem literally because early modern paper, as Joshua Calhoun reminds us, derived not just from cloth, but from a plant. And even more than most material things, paper held both a memory of its origins in the earth and an anticipation of its return to earth. We could enter this cycle at any point, but let's begin with the seed. Under the farmer's cultivation, the flaxseed organizes sun, water, and soil nutrients into the particular forms of Linum usitatissimum. Once harvested, the plants were broken down through acts of beating, combing, putrefaction, drying, cooking, more pounding, reduced to a mass of fibers that are then ordered into new forms, combed and spun into thread, woven into fabrics, cut and sewn into useful cloth and clothes. In use, these textiles immediately begin their descent back into disorder, becoming stained, torn, and frayed until they reached a point of inutility as cloth. Here we arrive at a crucial inflection point. Rather than simply discarding these rags, early moderns collected them and through both chemical and physical means accelerated their degradation in such a way as to create a new material, paper. In contrast to the compounded order that forms a piece of cloth, paper is made by successive acts of disordering. Following an arduous process of washing, beating, and sun bleaching, linen rags were fermented and then beaten, destroying the deliberate ordering imparted by those prior acts of combing, spinning, and weaving. The flax fibers, now flattened, frayed, and fibrillated, become part of a watery pulp whose fluid movements give paper its disorderly structure. And it's worth noting in this regard that no more than 15% of a paper's fibers can be oriented in any single direction, or the paper will be weak and pull apart easily. Unlike cloth, whose structure is mechanically defined, threads woven over and under, paper's bonds are contingent. They're essentially bonds of adjacency and circumstance. And for this reason, wet paper all too quickly returns to a pulp-like state. But barring a watery disaster, flax's fibers, formed into paper, became available for a new kind of ordering, the ordering of print. This order was found not only in the regularity of printed letters and their meaning, which differentiated generic sheets into particular pages of text, but in the printer's labor. In contrast to the loose gestural motions of the marbler, the printer's movements are deliberate. Each letter, space, and punctuating mark has to be assembled one by one to create the rectilinear order that structures the printed page and makes it legible. And yet, paper as a material was so useful, so valuable in the early modern period, that printed paper has long been recognized as a peculiar and unstable hybrid, an entanglement of form and matter, of content and material. In contrast to the previous phases that I've described, in which cloth replaces the plant or paper replaces cloth, paper and print coexist in one entity, and the materiality of paper repeatedly threatened to overcome or at least to supersede its printed content. As scholars like Leah Price and Amelie Juncker have noted, early modern authors were self conscious of the fact that reading was not the final or even necessarily the first way in which their writings were consumed. In satirically considering the many, quote, benefits which accrue to the public from these my speculations, end quote, Joseph Addison noted, quote, I must confess I have lighted my pipe with my own works for these 12 months past. My landlady often sends up her little daughter to desire some of my old spectators, and has frequently told me that the paper they are printed on is the best in the world to wrap spice in. They likewise make a good foundation for a mutton pie, as I have more than once experienced, and were very much sought for last Christmas by the whole neighborhood. End quote. Elsewhere, Mr. Spectator describes even more uses for printed paper. Paper could be turned into paper crackers, into kites, wallpapers, candlestick fringe, linings for hat cases and bandboxes. It could be shredded into snow for theatrical effects, and it could be pulped into paper mache. And of course, there was always the unmentionable and ultimate form of paper reuse, printed pages used and discarded in the privy's so-called night soil. For all of their variety, these forms of paper reuse can be separated into two major categories. In the first, the printed page maintains enough integrity that the text can still be read. These give rise to the figure of the beggar keeping up to date with yesterday's news, or the fictional device of a crucial piece of information found in the sugar wrapping. The other type of paper reuse is more absolute in its transformation. Shredded, pulped, or combusted, the form of the sheet is so disrupted that the text is also destroyed. These acts clinch the printed page's descent into disordered matter, even into elemental components that, deposited in the soil, might feed another round of flax production, hence restarting the cycling of form and matter. As a form of paper reuse, overmarbling doesn't fit neatly into either of these categories. On the one hand, as we've seen, the disorderly patterns of overmarbling disrupt the readability of the text. The text is no longer legible, or at least not transparently legible. It takes significant effort to access it. This was especially useful in the case of sheets printed with salacious words or valuable financial instruments. On the other hand, overmarbling doesn't destroy the sheet completely, and it doesn't even really destroy the text. Indeed, perhaps the most remarkable aspect of overmarbling is that over time, its transformation is reversed. Because marbling sits lightly on the surface of the paper, it wears away faster than the text. And as the marbling fades and abrades, the text of the page once again becomes available for reading, albeit in a very different context and by different audiences. The delayed revelation of underlying texts, which for reasons of censorship, inadequate interest, or faulty production did not sell in early America, is especially intriguing in light of the fact that the preservation of, quote, infinitely varied and minute sources, end quote, was one of Thomas's primary pursuits in his later life and motivated his founding of the American Antiquarian Society, the first historical society with a national focus. Thomas's Catholic interest in preserving all printed matter was undergirded by a protracted and decentered view of history, in which one generation cannot anticipate the needs and interests of the next. As he explained in his last will and testament, the Society's mission to collect and to collect and preserve, quote, embraces all time, past, present, and future, end quote. And he underscored the last of these by asserting that, quote, the benefits resulting from the American Antiquarian Society will be increased by time and will be chiefly received by a remote posterity, end quote. In light of these and similar remarks, Thomas's extensive use of overmarbling takes on new significance as a form of archival preservation. In a counterpoint to Addison lamenting the supersession of his text by the value of the paper on which it was printed, Thomas's use of overmarbling imagined a future in which printed waste sheets would be valued once again not just as paper, but as pages. At the same time, this was an indisputably uneven and idiosyncratic form of preservation. Only chance determined which sheets were used for overmarbling rather than to wrap a package or light a pipe. Sheets were haphazardly cropped to fit a given book. The survival of any given overmarbled sheet depends on the survival of the book that it covers, and so on. As a result, overmarbled bindings highlight not only disorder's crucial role in material transformation, but also the lasting effects of chaos on our historical understanding. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was such a wonderful transition also from the last session as performativity came up there. And I look forward to returning to that and to many of the other topics that came out of your paper. Our next speaker is Iris Brahms.
Many thanks to the organizers for inviting me to this intriguing conference. I enjoy participating. Blue paper as a metaphor and efficient solution. Using blue paper for drawings instead of colored ground drawings paper is one of the most ecological solutions. In the manufacturing process during the early modern period and after, the blue rags were not bleached, though dyes such as indigo coming from Asia or Northern European woad could be added. Furthermore, the fibers were not as carefully selected as for better quality paper, and gelatin sizing to make paper resistant enough for writing with a quill pen was less important. Italian artists were the pioneers in using blue paper for the desired light and shadow modeling, which ideally requires a colored ground. In my paper, I will investigate the questions when and under which circumstances artists north of the Alps decided to use blue paper. Beforehand, I would like to clarify two crucial issues which are often cause of misunderstandings. First, blue paper came into fashion in Venice before 1500, but the earliest preserved drawings on blue paper are by artists from regions of northern Italy, such as Bologna and Florence. During the 16th century, it also became a commonly used paper for drawing in Rome and elsewhere. North of the Alps, it was chosen by artists in most cases as a reference to the Italian style. I will come back to this. Second, Albrecht Dürer follows a long tradition of chiaroscuro drawing techniques on colored grounds. This is proven by extant Italian drawings from around 1300. In the north, there are drawings from the 1380s onwards, which I compiled in my dissertation published in 2016. The exchange between Italian and Northern artists concerning this technique began no later than the 14th century and continued through the 15th century. On the cover, you see an outstanding drawing from Nuremberg in the year 1482 is written on the painted frame below. In distinction, blue paper, rather than colored grounds just discussed, presents a different issue entirely. It is not detected in use by artists north of the Alps before Dürer. Recycling in a double sense. Blue paper is a product of recycling in a double sense. European paper of the early modern period was usually a secondary product made of rags in the first place. In addition, blue paper was even meant for wrapping wares, often turned into waste a second time. What artists undertook then is essentially a huge step, deciding to use a cheap material regarded as inferior as a base for their drawings. This step could only be taken at a time when paper manufacturing technology was producing increasingly fine paper of better quality, which had a knock-on effect on the quality of the byproduct, blue paper. The increasing relevance of this cost-efficient material, which could serve as a colored ground in and of itself, is certainly connected to artists' rising demands, as well as rising expectations towards artists, who had to work more efficiently as a result. This does not mean that inferior materials were chosen on purpose, but rather it seems likely that materials were used not only because of their quality. Their aesthetic potential was more important. Further benefits of blue paper were that it rendered time-consuming and material-intensive preparation of the paper sheets obsolete. Consequently, there is no drying process which required spreading the sheets out, and even particularly careful storage in the workshops became superfluous. When and where blue paper was first produced in Europe is not certain. It was probably a byproduct from the very beginning of hand paper making in Europe, which began in Spain and Italy in the 11th and 12th century. The first mention of the carta azzurra we know of occurs in the Bolognese Statute of 1389, which established state rules for the production of different qualities of paper. North of the Alps, on the other hand, there was no such clear statute, and only the watermarks give clear indication of dimensions and qualities. However, they varied greatly and were not applied systematically. Drawings on blue paper had several aesthetic, semantic, and economic functions. While Albrecht Dürer most likely intended to demonstrate his success in Venice to his audience in Nuremberg, Hans Burgmeier used blue paper to imitate the recently invented chiaroscuro woodcut. Jörg Bry the Elder's drawing shows a reflection on Italian methods in a double sense. Dürer's assimilation. Since Dürer is the most prominent example of my talk, and a lot has recently been published on his drawings, I only want to sum up very briefly that the large studies on blue paper executed by him during his stay in Venice in 1505 to 1507, I only show this example, are closely connected to the Italian drawing method using only the brush. It has never been questioned by scholars that he used Italian paper. However, the detectable watermarks are only similar to ones which have been found to come from Venice and other towns in northern Italy. But this is not the question here, and still the most likely scenario indeed. Change of scene. Hans Burgmeier from Augsburg was very much interested in inventing a new method of printing, the clair-obscur woodcut. Burgmeier's clair-obscur woodcut depicting Pope Julius II and dated 1511 resembles a coin. Different prints of the woodcut are extant, which vary in the tone of the color plate. In addition to the woodcuts, there is a colored ground drawing, see on the right, which is considered to be a preparation for printing. With regard to the tradition of drawing, we have to remember, however, that elaborate colored ground drawings were hardly ever direct models for art to be produced, such as panel or glass paintings, but rather had the status of representation pieces. Interestingly enough, it seems to have been less common to have the drawing the same size and format as the print, although this is probably what was intended here. This detail evokes an extraordinarily close interrelationship between manual work and technical reproduction. Another completely new argument is presented on the basis of my recent empirical analysis. The sheet, which is cut into a round shape, has a black background from which the dignitary stands out in profile. His features have been drawn by pen and brush in black and white on greenish prepared paper. But this is not the white paper covered with a green primer, which was particularly common on both sides of the Alps. Rather, and this is a telling discovery, blue uncoated paper was used here, which was then extensively tinted green. The original color of the uncoated paper intensifies the greenish ground. Additionally, soft transitions to stronger shading were creating with the watery wash in gray-brown, just as with the tone blocks in clair-obscur woodcuts. The Berlin colored ground drawing thus bears witness to Bookmeyer's intensive reflection on the new printing process. However, despite all the close attention paid to the production and aesthetics of the drawing and the print, a compromise remained in the respective outcome. In the drawing, the final white highlights had to be added by hand instead of just leaving the white paper blank. In the prints, the white areas also stand out in relief because of the high pressure on the paper during the printing process. Since colored papers are very rare among the extant drawings north of the Alps in the early 16th century, Bookmeyer's use of this paper in 1511 speaks for his determined examination of Italian drawing practice, regardless of where the paper was produced. For Bookmeyer, this occupation also led to the frequent use of red chalk. This does not mean that he necessarily spent any time in Italy. Nevertheless, a watermark was not found on this drawing, which would prove that blue uncoated paper was produced in Augsburg at that time. So trans-regional trade relations are to consider too. The Second Statute of Bologna of 1454 included the concession that paper producers were henceforth allowed to accept external commissions and to make paper which differed from the formats and weights named in the statute, as long as those papers were exported. Franz Irsigler showed how closely knit the networks were between the paper makers, both north and south and across the Alps. Bills and other sources documented in Picard's volumes of watermarks, for instance, prove that grayish wrapping paper was also produced in mills north of the Alps during the 16th century. In the paper mill founded 1390 close to Nuremberg, for example, paper of higher quality was too expensive and they were forced to continue exclusively with wrapping paper before closing down completely in 1456. Wrapping paper is characterized by irregularities. Since the otherwise avoided wool and silk fibers absorb the dye with varying intensity compared to linen and hemp. Also, the paper pulp is usually not stamped quite as extensively into a uniform substance as for high-quality white paper, so that coarser fibers remain in the pressed, dried, and finished paper. These fibers are visible on the paper surface of the Berlin drawing, even under the layer of the opaque black paint. This makes me think that since the less sized paper behaves in a way similar to blotting paper, it required a primer for a depiction with thin pen lines. Last change of scene. Jörg Breu's Budapest drawing with the story of Lucretia takes us in another direction. It is clearly a preparatory study for the oil painting in Munich dated 1528. Needless to say, the drawing is much smaller than the painting. You will also find some differences in the position of the figures, their drapery, or in the silhouette of the city seen through the loggia. Breu pays most attention to the architecture and its three-dimensional depiction in linear perspective. The construction of lines converging towards a single vanishing point even runs through the figures and was probably executed before they were added. The verso further underlines Breu's concern with spatial construction. In the recently published Catalogue raisonné of the German drawings in the Museum of Fine Arts in Budapest, Sylvia Bodnar pointed out that this drawing is, quote, one of Breu's most Italianate works, end of quote. And it seems likely that an artist based in Augsburg would have easily been able to consult Italian books on perspective by the likes of Alberti, Lorenzo Ghiberti, or Piero della Francesca. In 1525, 3 years before his death, Dürer published his treatise Unterweisung der Messung, which goes back to his studies of those sources. Still, one can immediately see that Breuil followed his own way, which does not match the Italian theories because it is not compelling for the depiction of the architecture. Andrew Morrow and others assume a journey to Italy in the 1520s in order to explain Breuil's interest in the Italian style, evidence of which may also be sought in the Italian prints in his possession. What Morrow emphasizes most, however, is the way in which German artists of the time generally reflected the Italian style. This, he argues, was triggered by the Reformation, which was felt as bringing uncertainty for the status of art itself. It led to a competition amongst German artists who wanted to show off their ability to refer to a tradition and culture like the Italians. Referring to Heinrich Vogther's Kunstbüchlein from 1538, Morrow argued convincingly that this competition, quote, also displays the desire to emulate, if not surpass, the Italians in the use of a consciously homegrown classical style, end of quote. Against this wider background, I would like to come back to the material used as support for the drawing. Even in its discolored state today, the blue paper Breuil has chosen gives us yet another example for the view held by artists north of the Alps, that blue paper is a sign for Italian method. In referring to Italian as well as regional sources, Breuil's Italianate style is a result of reflection in a double sense. It is not decisive that the watermark is illegible and that we cannot tell definitely whether Breuil drew on Italian or Southern German paper. To conclude and add a further twist at the end, several drawings in the Erlangen collection of prints and drawings prove that using blue paper became more common for artists working in Augsburg during the first half of the 16th century. As far as there are detectable watermarks, they are most similar to those being applied in northern regions close to the Alps. Nevertheless, these drawings have a certain relationship to Venice, which again shows us that blue paper was used as a sign of reference to Italy. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Iris. This was so interesting because when we talk about print, we usually think about dissemination and where paper travels to, and you've introduced this element of how paper traces to a certain locale. So I hope we'll come back to that issue in the discussion. Okay, our final speaker in this session is Heather Wolfe. Hi, Heather.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to Shira and Caro for inviting me to speak at this conference and for creating a format that invites so many people to participate. And of course, to Steve and Wand and everyone at the Huntington for making it happen despite 2020. My topic for today changed after the conference organizers reached out early on in the pandemic and asked us to reflect on how our research on paper has evolved during the pandemic. Like many of you, my research came to a halt once my entire household began sharing the same small space and internet bandwidth 24/7. In this changed environment, I started thinking about how hypothetically I might return to researching the socio-materiality of early modern paper without being able to consult collection material. Is it possible to study materiality digitally? What sort of ephemeralities become visible in a digital image? How can this sort of distance from the physical object render it more tangible and interesting and bring us closer to understanding the social codes of an earlier era, which in turn shines a light on our own? What are the paradoxes and possibilities of pursuing paper preferences in a pandemic? Sorry for my alliteration. Today, we have no problem looking at our mail and immediately categorizing it without even reading any of the text. We could probably even do it with our eyes closed. We know that a bill or a piece of junk mail, what it looks and feels like. We recognize the size, shape, and thickness of a holiday card and the smaller format of a thank you note. We know the coated glossy cardstock used for election solicitations and the thinner coated paper of tri-fold takeout menus. We all have blank book types that we prefer. moleskins, composition notebooks, legal pads, loose sheets, the blank margins of the conference program, touch screens, and styluses. We didn't learn how to interpret any of this from reading a textbook. We just knew. Given the wide variety of paper types and blank book types available to early modern writers in England, surely many of them just knew too. How can we get at what this looked like? And what do the unwritten rules surrounding paper etiquette reveal about social bonds and networks? As scholars of the period, we tend to focus primarily on the text and lump the substrate into the huge category of paper, as opposed to parchment or something else, even though there are many different kinds and qualities of paper and many different ways of using it, as we've seen already today. Surely in the past, they could tell their legal size unicorn watermarked paper from their Venice paper, from their everyday Normandy pot paper. Surely when they picked up a quire of paper at the haberdasher or grocer, they didn't just ask for paper, but for a specific type of paper or paper for a specific purpose. This appears to be true. Looking at account books, we see people like Edward Deering and Bess of Hardwick regularly purchasing multiple kinds of paper and occasionally letting us know how they use it. In a study I did of paper prices in Elizabethan and early Stuart England, I found over 18 types of paper. Oh, there we go. Mentioned in the accounts, mostly elite individuals. As this next slide shows, there was a huge difference in price from the cheapest and most common form of writing paper at 3 pence and 4 pence a quire, and a quire is 25 sheets, and the most premium types, royal and imperial. An advertisement for a coffee house paper auction in 1695 reveals hundreds of paper types and blank book categories. And an account book from the 1630s kept by Mary Petway for the Earl of Down bears an inked inscription most likely added by the stationer or binder prior to selling, which describes the price and type of paper in the tacketed stationer's binding, which was a codex style traditionally used from as far back as the 14th century in Italy for making account books. And here's an image of the binding as a whole that this inscription is on the spine of and what's inside. So the tacket sewing means that the sewing structure was externalized and you could take the sewing out to add or remove quires as you needed them. Mary Baumfeld notes in her recipe book from 1626 2 pages that were improperly sized. She labels them sinks and sinks a little. And you might see this slide tomorrow because I've shared it with other people. And so she left these blank because they were not suitable for taking ink. And she noted this for future users or inscribers of her book in case they were opportunistic about these blank pages. Thomas Doxey in 1611-12, sorry, acknowledges a socio-material mishap in his apology to his master, Walter Bagot. Writing, I must crave pardon for writing in so bad paper, for I have lost the key of my desk and can come to no other. In an essay from that came out, I think earlier this year, I described how the way in which a letter was folded and sealed for sending conveyed meaning, and used as an example of moment of failure, when Robert Cecil, Earl of Salisbury, lamented to a colleague that no women were about to seal up one of the Queen's letters in the way the Queen had specified. And it would have looked something like this letter to James VI, which was pleated and folded into a small oblong rectangular packet and wrapped with silk embroidery floss underneath seals on both sides of the small packet. So this type of letter in this case was written by a woman and needed to be sealed by another woman, but the men around the Queen were responsible for overseeing the many small and consequential steps that went into the sending of a royal letter in a very specific fashion. Jana D'Ambrosio and Daniel Smith now have a glossary at letterlocking.org and a YouTube channel with dozens of different types of ways to lock a letter. It is in the rare moments of articulated failure that we begin to appreciate what's at stake for writers and to learn where to look for additional examples. since letter writing manuals and handwriting and contact manuals from the period are mostly silent on the matter of paper. So yes, early modern people could probably tell their love letters from their bills, from their newsletters, from their autograph letters from the Queen, from the size and quality of the paper and the way it was folded into a packet for sending or acquired and bound into a blank book. For loose manuscripts in particular, it has been hard for us to recover this information because archival storage conventions mean that almost all correspondence, early modern or otherwise, has been opened and flattened. Once a letter is flat, the words on the page dominate, and the haptic experience of the original recipient, as he or she broke open the seal and took in its materiality of the letter itself, this is difficult to retrieve. As is our ability to perceive the myriad ways in which early modern people conformed to social conventions or couldn't or didn't with their paper choices, or to know or see when paper failed them and when it helped them succeed. So going back to my original question, can digitized images help us see the connection between form and function? Think about how special collections photography labs operated until very recently. They were required to make money, and they did this through restricted access to very expensive publication quality images of collection material. Publication quality means super huge files with on-axis, like straight overhead, perfectly diffused, shadow-free lighting, with extensive and time-consuming post-processing, including color correction and cropping out reference targets. These images often obscure what the researcher actually needs to see. And I'm just going to show a couple of slides here. This is from a great blog post by Lindsay Tyne at the Morgan that came out in May. And she just shows the difference between raking light and normal illumination in a digital image. So raking light is when the lighting angle is at a much, not overhead, but at an angle. So you can see the watermark and the chain lines here and some other things. And here we have some other examples of what raking light, how it can help you see paper differently. So both of these actually relate to John Donne, a letter from John Donne on the left that's written on Venice paper with gilt edges on it. And gilt edges on single sheets of paper are really difficult to see. It's hard in any kind of lighting to get it just the right angle, but in a studio, they have access to lighting that can make that really jump out. And I think we will find that many more letters that are written on this fine paper actually do have gilt edges. And whether or not people understood that when they received the letter is another question, but I think they did. And then on the right, you see some fiber that is still visible on the surface of a piece of paper. And that second image, this is the full image. And I just got to this by searching raking light in the digital image database at the Folger. And then there are also examples of what you can see with transmitted light. And here's a cover, the cover of Joshua Calhoun's book, and some more on transmitted light in a moment. So the business model is transforming before our eyes in terms of photography labs and what they need to do, with free open access supported by Creative Commons attributes replacing expensive restricted access. The model has flipped, but the product is still the same. Neutral lighting of images that obscures the substrate and privileges the text. The Folger and other reading rooms now allow researchers to photograph just about anything they want from the collection and do whatever they want with it. And at the Folger, we just started providing cell phone pictures taken by our reference librarians, Abby Weinberg and Rachel Dankert, as a separate collection of images in our digital image database. And they often take those for researchers who are not getting what they need from the even light of our professional digital images, or we haven't yet digitized it yet. But what if, and we also engage in large-scale digitization of various parts of the collection, and we use the normal shadowless light for that. But what if we were to try imaging using multiple light angles for an entire collection? Conservators take photos like these as a matter of course to better understand the substrate, which in turn guides their conservation treatment decisions. But how could it help the rest of us? So the Folger actually did exactly this a few years ago with a collection that was acquired in the 1920s by Henry and Emily Folger. The E. Williams Watermark collection was compiled by a bookseller named E. Williams. He was obsessed with disproving the Baconian theory that Francis Bacon was the actual author of Shakespeare's plays. So he proposed to the Folgers that he do this by collecting examples of over 1,000 watermarks on dated legal manuscripts during the period 1550 to 1650, which he called the Shakespearean era. So he had absolutely no interest in the content of these manuscripts except for the date. He reported that the Baconians believed that numerous small variations in the English watermarks have a cipher meaning, and that Bacon actually had a private paper mill of his own working for this set purpose. Williams, on the other hand, thought these small variations were made on an annual basis by papermakers, and therefore could not only disprove the Baconian theory, but also provide a map to dating all undated manuscripts from this period. Neither of them were right, but the Folger benefited from the premise in that we now have a collection of watermarks for researchers to study in other ways. When I first encountered this collection many years ago, I was intrigued by the fact that these watermarked papers had writing on them, and that the writing revealed that the majority of the legal, financial, and manorial documents came from a single source, the Hale family of Kings Walden, a merchant family that amassed significant land holdings in the 16th and 17th centuries. In 2010, manuscript cataloger Nadia Seiler created a finding aid for this collection and wrote a terrific blog post describing the process. She writes, "When I started this project, I was uncertain what common threads would emerge. Instead, it was only in the process of organizing item-level descriptions into series according to document type, and then listing them chronologically, that I noticed how similar the descriptions of several fragmentary manuscripts were." So she re-examined them. So these two leaves had different shelf marks and was able to bring them together. And she was able to match up the fold lines and wear as well. So these had different watermarks. And what E. Williams did when he saw these was he saw an opportunity, a twofer, and separated out the last page of this draft of this final Concord because it had a different watermark. If Nadia hadn't created the finding aid around the principle of the Hale family, this last leaf would have remained a textual orphan. Since the last sheet was also the wrapper for the draft, was it useful that it was slightly bigger? And you can't totally see it here because they're not completely flat, but it is a bigger sheet of paper. Or did the writer run out of paper and grab paper from a different shopping trip? This is something that would not be able to spot, easy to spot if one was looking at only normal light images. So here's the last page under transmitted light. What I realized this morning when I was pulling this image for this draft was that the scribe is doing something else here. So you can see the two watermarks and they are different from the rest. And so that's why E. Williams separated them out, and then Nadia was able to put them back together because of the textual continuity. But there's something else interesting going on here, which is that the scribe, this is a draft. So the scribe is double spacing the text, and he's using the chain lines as guidelines. And in this period, as you know, until you became quite proficient with a quill, you would create guidelines for writing on leaves of paper, either with dry point, like a stylus, which leaves a slight indentation in the paper, or a pencil, which could later be erased. In this case, since the scribe was writing on full sheets of paper, the chain lines were horizontal rather than vertical and spaced perfectly for writing a draft. And in the rest of this document, in the other types of paper too, because the chain lines are horizontal, this writer also uses them as guidelines and writes right on them. When it came time to digitize this collection, after many long discussions between curators and reading room staff and the photography lab, we decided that it would be feasible to digitize both the text and the watermarks using both normal on-axis lighting and transmitted light. And rather than just including a detail of the watermark, we included the whole leaf with the watermark on it under transmitted light, since there's so much more to paper analysis than just watermarks. So now, and I realize I need to speed up a little here, so I'll start moving quickly. You can see Vatman's tears on this example, for example. So you can see them down on the left and the bottom, in the middle, and the top on the left, and the bottom on the right side as well. And then we've included a ruler in all these images so that you can calculate the size of the paper, the watermark, and the distance between the chain lines. So this is a collection that was originally a family archive, purchased in the early part of the 20th century and arranged in a way that privileged the paper and paper makers, and became a roadmap for a social network of paper itself. Nadia then created a finding aid that privileged the text and text makers while also including details from the previous intellectual arrangement. Her finding aid is thus a finding aid embedded in another finding aid. Two data sets waiting for a researcher to take them on and merge them. The digitized version of the collection makes this duality clearly visible, allowing researchers to seek out the unwritten rules behind patterns of paper consumption by a middling merchant class family in early modern England. This then becomes a baseline for interpreting the paper profiles and preferences of other families, and in turn, the invisible small acts and decisions which cumulatively help us better understand the social ties and social glue that connected early modern English human beings. Many kinds of research have come to a halt during the pandemic because of the inability to access special collections reading rooms. This forced closure is an opportunity to rethink the services we can provide as a library and the extent to which we could and should engage the community in crowdsourcing projects like scanning documents using transmitted light and allowing volunteers in the community to add tags and annotations to them, which identify watermark types or the presence of many, many other physical features. Now that publishers are no longer our main clients, our imaging lab should focus not only on traditional high-res surrogates, but also on the needs of researchers who want to understand the materiality of the text and substrate and what links them. We should provide a suite of imaging services that include neutral lighting, as well as transmitted light and raking light and other forms of light as needed. This could provide a wealth of data, not only for paper historians, but for anyone who wants to understand the nuances and social norms of early modern paper culture and the intentional and largely invisible paper choices made on a daily basis by paper consumers. As librarians, we can provide visual data for a sort of computational material analysis or distance reading that helps researchers flag when and where and how to drill down and research further. A project like the digitization of the E. Williams Watermark collection / Hale Family Papers collection gives us two collections in one. They can be used separately with paper specialists, conservators, and art historians using the transmitted light images and learning more about paper manufacture, and historians using the normal light images and learning more about a merchant class family on the rise. But the hope is that they can be integrated, that someone plugs a call number into Luna and gets both sets of images and sees the interdisciplinary potential. Chasing the unicorns galloping across the mountains and valleys of previously folded bonds and obligations until they find themselves in a magical field of hearts and roses and grapes, warmed by a perfect sun on a cloudless day, temporarily forgetting the headlines and basking in the joys of transmitted light. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heather, and thank you to all of our panel speakers in this second session. So I want to invite all of our panelists to turn their, if you're comfortable, turning your videos back on so we could see your faces, not just the people who've just spoken, but all of our panelists, because I'm hoping to engage discussion. We have some really wonderful questions in the Q&A from our audience, but I thought we could start by engaging a discussion among our panelists. And I want to kind of begin a question and maybe hope that one of the other panelists will help me advance it into from a kind of thought into a question or a more developed thought. And this is maybe to begin on the topic of visibility. And what it occurs to me that a lot of the research that we're hearing about today is asking for a shift, a paradigm shift in what we're looking at, from turning our attention from one thing to another thing, either from surface to text, or from text to surface, or body to text, or different kinds of materials and processes. And from the start with Jennifer's paper, I was wondering whether text always wants to be read, whether it sort of jumps out, and whether it's sort of inevitable that text will be read by people who are able to read it, and if it's ever really possible to ignore text, or at what point in a sort of visual and material culture do we become comfortable with not reading text. And I was very struck by the kind of echo of that question in Heather's paper, when Heather, you talked about sorting mail and how we sort of all know what various mail feels like, and we can gauge meaning and importance just based on format and texture and these things. So but I also was thinking about the kind of violence of not seeing, or the implied violence of not seeing. And this came up, I think, really in Caro's paper, with her asking us to think about the uniformity of what she called a white abstract surface. And I kept thinking about a number of things. I was thinking about Toni Morrison's book, Playing in the Dark, Whiteness in the Literary Imagination, and how she she uses American literature to bring issues of race that are sort of suppressed in these various works of literature into the foreground. But I also started to think of the black on white paintings of Glenn Ligon. And so I was thinking about these questions of visibility and invisibility. So first, I want to just ask if there are any other panelists who were struck by the way that this theme had been threaded through the 4 papers that we heard, and maybe wanted to comment on that, or generate a question out of that first impression that I had.
I'll just say something, because I was thinking along similar lines, Shira. My thought was less about visibility. The word I was using was transparency. I saw transparency in sort of many of the talks in terms of the way we think about seeing through things. And actually it was a detail that I was going to ask Iris, which is that, on that, I think it was the Burkmeyer, or no, whose was it? The Lucretia. Is that Burkmeyer? Or?
It's Broy.
Broy, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
That he had the sort of like vanishing point on the back and the front. And my question was like, is the same vanishing point? Like, do you hold that sheet up to the light and you can see the vanishing point on both sides? Like, does it actually function like that, or is it a different vanishing point?
No, it's more or less the same. Beside that, it's reversed. So
it doesn't correspond to the vanishing point on the drawing side.
No.
Okay, because I was kind of assuming maybe, part of what you do is you hold it up to the light. And so I was thinking,
no.
Yeah, I was thinking about, Jennifer's not quite visible words through the marbling, and the sort of the creation of a kind of film in Caro's paper. And so that's how I started to move into the world of like transparent objects. And of course, Heather's point about, the sort of, I love the term, I've never really used the term before, transmitted light, but I'm going to, think about that in terms of the see-through aspect of watermarks. So for me, I think I'm not really helping your point, Shira, but the transparency of the object to me really came through in this session in terms of how, we see with and through, the slender film of paper as well.
Yeah, I think seeing through is a way of thinking about what we are seeing or not seeing. and again, this question of surface as it relates to something on top of it.
I just wanted to add to both of your points, Shira and John, just another vocabulary word for us to all consider, for the panelists to consider, and that would be abstraction, because I was also thinking, visually about abstraction, and across all 4 papers, especially in Jennifer's work, and then also in Caroline, in your work in the beginning when you were showing us the black and white pages from the novel. While, okay, now we know, what was photographed and what might actually have some color and depth and texture to it, those black and white pages looked really abstract to me. And I think that there's a purpose behind that need for abstraction.
Can I
Yeah,
ask?
maybe just to follow up. Oh,
Go ahead, Jennifer.
okay. No. Cheryl, I think the word abstraction is really helpful here, because one thing that really came out to me in pursuing this research on over-marbling is the way in which it abstracted the text for me, because the patterns of the marbling force you to see the text not as sort of transparent language, but as forms on the page. And so, yeah, I think thinking about how the juxtaposition of different kinds of order can bring out abstraction is really helpful.
May I ask you, Jennifer, directly? Because I wondered if there are also examples where you maybe find an interaction of the marbling and the text. If there's someone was thinking to hide some words and others not, or whatever, is there also such a game you find in at least some exceptions?
Unfortunately, I don't know if we can call it a game, but you definitely see moments where unintentional revelations are problematic. So, for example, that title page of Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure is one that comes up again and again. Mm-hmm. And in one case, there's a ledger book cover where somebody has crossed out pleasure, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because it was sort of visible against the empty space of the page and the way that the marbling pattern happened to fall. And so that was clearly not acceptable in that case. The other thing you do see too is interesting changes between front and back covers. So sometimes an over marbled front cover will have the text oriented in the conventional fashion, like left to right lines, and then the back will be oriented vertically. Oh. And one thinks probably there was a kind of play at work there, because it would be easier actually to have the front and back covers be similarly oriented.
Yeah, very true. Yeah. Thank you.
I would just maybe jump in. I think I like the way this conversation makes us think about the value of abstraction when we think about visibility, what that action is doing, and in Jennifer's example, like what sort of play or possibility or aesthetic is available. And then also just legibility. And so I'm thinking really one that really struck me was Cheryl's example earlier, when you were talking about, what was legible to you and was not legible to me, and I imagine to others, that the ship you were looking at was a certain kind of ship, right? And that obviously the point being that there should never be those bodies in it, but if there's those bodies there in even a smaller ship, it's even more packed in this way that there's something that's not. It's visible to it, we'd all see it, but it wasn't legible to us, and the necessity of doing that abstracted work of acknowledging that what we can see and what is then also what we can interpret.
Right, I think to your point, Joshua, it becomes literally an abstraction, and it's only if I won't go into the boring details of how many times I've gone to an archive and pulled out a loop or something that I needed to actually see closer, but it's something that unless you can really get up close, often it is this abstraction that becomes all the more horrific when you can actually see what it is.
Esther, let's hear from you.
Hi. well, sort of talking of abstraction, a sort of theme that touches on some of Caro's paper as well, and thank you all for those wonderful papers. I just wondered, again for Jennifer, if you could comment. I was really struck by the way that those marbling patterns, despite their seeming randomness and serendipity, actually acquire these wonderful names as a kind of taxonomy of the marbling. In other words, an order to the disorder. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's actually interesting. I should have probably have mentioned that those names come after the fact. So it's really only in the mid and later 19th century that we developed this taxonomy of marbling names and categories. And actually in the early 19th century, what you see is this very curious lack of desire to distinguish between what I think of as marbling patterns and marbling colorways. So in the first English language text on marbling, the author Hugh Sinclair provides 12 patterns, but then within each sort of chemically different pattern, he says, oh, but you could exchange blue for red, and that would be a different pattern, right? Like, so where we wouldn't call that a different pattern, we would say that's just a different colorway. He's not interested in trying to pursue that level of organization.
Jennifer and everyone, we have a Q&A from the audience that I think really segues nicely from what you just said, Jennifer. And it's a question about the elusive connections. This is from Colin Fanning. The elusive connections between paper marbling and geological materials. So he says, in the name of the technique itself, of course, but especially in some of the 19th century examples you showed that were less obviously patterned and instead cultivated chance and complexity, as you point out. So Colin asks, I'm curious, how did marbling come into its name? And do you have any sense that there were explicit lapidary metaphors or mimesis at work in some applications of the technique? If so, how might that tie into notions of stability and durability and the cycle of ordering and disordering that you unpack so beautifully?
Yeah, that's a great question, Colin. And I'm still regretful that I missed your CAA panel on geology and art. As far as I've been able to tell, there are no English language, like early English language references to the relationship between lithic marbling and paper marbling, which is very curious and seems kind of unbelievable. But one way I think we might approach this is actually through the etymological origins of the word marble. And Fabio Berri gave this beautiful reading where he traced the word marble back to the Latin marmor and the Sanskrit mar, and that's a word that refers to the murmuring of the sea. So even in lithic marbling, we might say actually marbling doesn't refer to the permanence of lithic marbling. Marbling always has this prior reference to motion and flux and instability.
I wonder if I could sorry, wonder if I could just, with that in mind, actually ask about the registration of gesture as well in the marbling process as well, because it seems that's something that you described really wonderfully, but I was also thinking about how this might lead us to thinking about forms of typographic gesture as well, as we might call it. So, I'm thinking about Esther's work here on Buick and inky fingerprints, the kinds of things that can go wrong, that chance is built into the process of printing too, and that it also isn't just order as such. And thinking about those gestural accidents, if you like, that become abstract in the marbling process, sort of drew my attention to the chance that's always imminent in printing too.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. And it is worth also noting that many marblers, especially later marblers, become obsessed with trying to produce similarity, even if they can't produce identity, right? So the virtuosic marbler is able to produce a series of sheets that look the same, even if in detail they are not the same. And this is making me think too of your paper, Caro, and the sort of gesture of beating the tapa or how the kind of chaotic gesture of beating leads to the production of these patterns.
Yeah, that was a question that Walter Melian asked as well about kind of the beating, and I didn't. I've thought a bit myself about the history of rag beaters versus this kind of beating that I'm thinking of in terms of making tapa. And what I said to Walter is that I think of rag beaters and the history of beating down rags as really a dissolving of form to make something new, which of course has a long kind of discourse in early modern histories of paper too, especially Christological resonances in terms of like the breaking down of the self and the body to, you know, rise as the new Christological or risen Christ in terms of the white paper. Whereas with the beaters in terms of the making of tapa, and this is a new project for me, so that's why I'm really more interested in the textile sample books as a whole, and this is just a minor discourse for me. But it seems to me that it's more about creating form. So instead of breaking down form through beating, it's creating form through beating. And I think that this is the distinction that I see in terms of thinking about rag beaters versus the geometric mallets that were used to create the surface of the tapa. So more creation through beating versus a destruction through beating.
Can I ask you something about that too? Because some of my colleagues who work on tapa here in Sydney, mostly, you know, sort of Central Pacific tapa, like Pitcairn, Tahiti, there it's so this is a question in my way about like labor and gender, because on Pitcairn it's mostly women's art, like tapa making is passed from mother to daughter, and so whereas, you know, most of the European paper workshop I've encountered so far have been mostly, you know, dudes affairs where it's guys in workshops, you know, with vats. So like, what do you think about the relationship of this, the sort of the labor question about these different forms of, you know, making?
Yeah, I mean, although it was the women who were often sorting the rags, right? Who were doing the dangerous job of sorting the rags and stripping them, the women and the children. So, but yeah, in terms of actually in the mill, who was really beating them and the vatmen and stuff, it definitely was male. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, people have written about it a little bit, not so much. I mean, in terms of, I think about the gender question, I guess I primarily have encountered it around misunderstandings among Europeans when they first went to the Oceania, and examples like the one which I mentioned in which women would unwrap the tapa from their body and they thought that the women were offering themselves, but it wasn't necessarily that. And so that's mainly how I've encountered it. But in terms of questions of labor, it's an important point and one to think about more.
And because this question about gender also came up in our Q&A from Sarah Austin, who is also asking about marblers and what we know about the gender marblers. Jennifer, do you want to comment on that?
As far as I know, they were all men. I mean, obviously there may have been some exceptions, but I haven't come across any accounts of women marblers.
I want to come back to something that came up really sort of across all four papers, and that was, you know, starting with Jennifer's paper. Jennifer was contrasting order and chaos, and Jennifer, you were maybe suggesting that the marbling process was somewhat chaotic, and I'm not sure how I feel about that word. I mean, maybe there is, I mean, I understand what you mean. There's something primordial about it. So maybe in that sense, but I also wonder, there's also something quite natural about it. I mean, order is unnatural, right? And the imposition of order, the grid is unnatural. And I also felt across the papers, there was sort of order and then something else. And there were these different terms that were kind of coming up in opposition to order, and particularly in thinking about about the grid, which of course came up in Iris's paper when we were looking at the perspective, in the Breuil drawing, and in Caro's paper with the matrix, and came up in the raked light that that Heather was showing us. So I'm wondering about how we might engage order as something that is related to formal and technical processes. But also, I'm really thinking back to session 1 of today and thinking about bureaucracy and the imposition of order on paper in that regard. So I'm wondering if anyone else wants to think through this with me, or pick up on that sort of line of thinking.
Maybe I'll just jump in really quickly, Shira. I think you're absolutely right to call out my use of chaos. What I want to indicate, what I sort of want to refer to there is not chaos in the maybe conventional sense of total uncontrol and mess, but rather the chaos of nature, right? So the chaos that is the scientific idea of things being so unpredictable, but not necessarily unordered or illogical, right? Like nature has reasons and processes that it will follow, but the complexity of those are such that we can't we can't affect a full control or curation of those effects.
I think also, Shira, to draw out the question of order, I was also struck how all of our papers were really talking about paper as a substance, as a material for packaging and wrapping, really. I mean, Jennifer's, the marble is really a way to cover a book. It's a way to package a book. And Heather was really thinking about the ways in which different letters and things are packaged and folded. And Tapa's, it's a fabric, but it's also, it's sacred because it's used to wrap really kind of sacred objects or materials. And this is something that people obviously talk about a lot in terms of histories of paper, right? Like people always say, oh, it was wrapping paper, it was, twist for spices or these different things. But I wonder if there's a way to think about this question of paper as wrapping and packaging material and order, and the ways in which, for example, for Jennifer's paper, and the ways in which there's allowed this kind of play on the covers of these books, but it's ultimately a way to order and to package them, and thinking about the ways in which packaging and play and order come in. I mean, that's not really full form, but I was struck that there was this relationship through all these papers about, and blue paper obviously was famous for packaging everything from sugar to many other things. So there is this relationship between packaging and order, I think, and the ways in which when paper becomes packing material, it kind of breaks down into something else and plays a little bit more, perhaps. I don't know.
Can I just add to that question? I've sort of had on my mind Cheryl's talk, and somehow the phrase that you used of the icon, the slave ship icon, has been kind of preoccupying me because it's such an interesting phrase to use, and it kind of just made me think about part of, I think Carol was invoking, somebody was invoking sort of this a kind of religiosity or a spiritual or belief. In any case, I guess I wanted to know if your use of that phrase, if you could just elaborate on what you take it, why you use that phrase. I also was thinking about marbling and that the definition that Jennifer offered from Fabio Barry, having to do with precariousness and sea movement. And I guess part of what made me ask this question is also Caro's point about packaging and order, which is obviously the sort of quintessential effect of the slave ship. It is this image of order. And there's something so self-referential about it in that sense, that it's an image of transit and of movement. And of course, this is something that it's activating in order to become a vehicle for activism against precisely what it's showing. And so I feel like that packaging aspect that Caro is getting at is sort of a really very productive one.
Thank you, Nina and Caro. Yeah, definitely. So where to begin? The term, when I call this image the slave ship icon, I'm looking at the number of different iterations, the number of different forms it has taken, not just in the early modern era, in the late 18th century, in the early 19th century, or the ways in which it was used by abolitionists who were, on the one hand, ultimately interested in ending slavery as an institution, chattel slavery in the British colonies and elsewhere in and around the Atlantic, but also how they took this sort of two-step way to go about their international and also local campaign. And so when I think about the term icon, it was one that came to mind actually in my research and in interviewing living, breathing, working people in the UK who work with visual images, and thinking about how this image has been translated over more than 200 years through histories of activism, but also rekindled in the early 20th century around the time when sort of there's this nostalgia for sea and for sailing and for trade through the images of ships, and then how it kind of gets reinvigorated again, the image itself, through African liberation movements in the mid 20th century, the Black Arts movement and Black Power movements in the mid to late 1960s and then onwards. So it's an image that, while I don't think I really showed any of the contemporary iterations, but is one that has been translated and sort of used in, I almost want to say religiously, actually quoted by artists, wherein that form, that packaging form, as you're calling it, is something that they continually refer to. I would also say that, once it goes beyond the very first very long, quotation title iteration by the committee at Plymouth in 1788, the image that is this bullet-shaped plan view of the slave ship that kind of gives the initial idea of it, to one that adheres to form, that is the form of naval architectural drawing, where you have longitudinal cross-section views, plan views, and so on, that type of packaging through naval architectural drawing, and also with the textual component that goes along with the image itself, that is the text that describes what it is that you see, that helps to direct the viewer to the atrocities of the slave trade, but also to things like measurements. And it's a textual insinuation that also, I think, refers to the Enlightenment era, but also the way in which many of the abolitionists had to speak directly to parliamentarians and others who were engaged in this commerce, which was a business. So that idea of packaging human beings for certain modes and levels of production, I think is very much part and parcel to the way the image appears to us and appeared to people in the late 18th century. The last thing I'll add, kind of getting back to maybe a question of, what is it, chaos, or what did you call it, John, randomness, abstraction, and so on. There was a one slide where I was comparing a watercolor drawing that was made by a lieutenant who had been on one of the naval ships that caught a ship illegally trading in slaves in the mid 18th century, and in this drawing you get to see the sort of the randomness, the lack of order, the disorder of the space of the hold where people are stored as human cargo. They are there interspersed with burlap and sacks of potatoes and barrels, wooden casks of I don't know, water, whatever it is, but other supplies in that cargo hold. And I think that when you read the description against the actual very ordered image that's so packaged as you put it, you get to see the disconnect between that image, the orderly image, and also the randomness and disarray that's actually the space of that transatlantic voyage. Thank you.
I can't resist just adding the point that people who really know about paper in the 18th century would know, but that ship's ropes, I think, am I right in saying, those who know, that ship's ropes are among the materials that are recycled into paper? So there's a kind of afterlife of a ship in paper making also.
Yes, that's a wonderful point, Esther. And to Nina's question, Cheryl, I thought that I was wondering whether there was also maybe an act of resistance in calling this an icon, because in the kind of theory of icons, of religious icons, the way that icons work is to not diminish through replication, right? That the replica is authenticated through. The process of replication is authenticated rather than some sense of loss. And so I think that in calling it an icon, there's maybe there's some way of holding on to that its ability to be effective.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Was it an active resistance? Probably so. I guess when I think about the image, it's the type of image that I guess I've found in my research that is the most memorable image that exists when one might think about historical representations of slavery or the slave trade. And so I think that's also part of the reason that I chose to use that that term. Yeah, thank you.
I'm going to take one more question, and that's from an audience member, Erin Maines, and Erin asks, I wonder if Jennifer and Caro could respond to the issue of waste and reuse. What connotations does recycling or waste have for paper, especially given that European papers come from waste rags? With the tapa, there is a different context there as well. It's processed first to become this. Is that right? So I wondered if either of you want to engage that, or I know several of our panelists have sort of written about this topic of waste. So it'd be interesting to hear what people have to say to that topic.
Yeah, I feel a little shy. I feel like in particular, we have a real expert in the room here on waste and paper, and among many people. So I don't, I mean, I think for me, the tapa is actually, I think it specifically is well, I have thought a lot about waste in terms of European paper. I really understand the tapa much more in the context of this publication as a kind of, as a curiosity or as any other sort of object that would have been brought back by Europeans and collected and ordered and cataloged and archived or put in a museum. So for me, the tapa is very much actually not connected to histories of waste in the same way that one might think of in terms of other histories of European paper or in the ways that many Europeans themselves discussed paper. But I know it's something that many of our panelists have thought a lot about. So I'm not going to say any more on the subject.
I would also like to hear from others, but I will just say that when this research into overmarbled papers was really enabled by a cataloging term that the American Antiquarian Society uses, which is over marbled printed waste. And as I've worked on this project longer, I've come to have a kind of tricky relationship to that term, because it seems increasingly evident to me that printed waste was never waste, right? Like it always was going to be used for something else. But nevertheless, still incredibly useful for the researchers. So it's like, what are you going to do?
I'm going to see if Josh wants to have the last word on waste.
I don't know how to take that, Shira. Okay, yeah. I was thinking of Susan Strasser's really wonderful book, Waste and Want, and when I saw Aaron's question, and I think she's picking up in some ways on the sort of anthropological work of Mary Douglas. There's no such thing as absolute dirt, right? There's no such thing as absolute waste, and so I think in some ways this connects all the way back to what Shira was saying at the opening of our morning about the interaction between like an ecosystem and a capitalistic system, or in a colonial or exploitative or settler system, right? That there's a sort of, we only call it waste sort of in retrospect. So what we see so early on is this and Susan Strasser talks really well, speaks to this really well, is the kind of work that had to be done to convince people to get rid of their rags, right? Because they weren't being wasted. They were being, you could still get a rag rug, and we don't think about that, but it's, this is sort of, you had a rag bag and you use these things, and they were in some ways like sort of, they were kind of waste, but only in a sense that they were recirculated within the oikos, within the household. And then there's this really a lot of it, we see a lot of it in early American newspapers, as we sort of get this republic of letters that doesn't have enough rags to make paper, and they have to get people to let go of their rags. Like, don't insulate your walls with them, don't make rag rugs, hang your rag bags under the Bible. And then we get into a conversation about miscegenation, about how to like separate your rags into dirty and colors and clean white. And so this idea of waste, the ways that, what I like about the question, Aaron, is it just gets into all these questions of waste and what we call waste and how we think of waste is embedded so deeply in this conversation about paper, in ways I think we're all still puzzling out.
Well, I think we can continue to puzzle them out tomorrow. So I want to just remind everyone that we'll reconvene here in this space, wherever that is for you, at 9 o'clock Pacific time. I want to thank our audience.
It's actually 9:15, Shira.
Oh, well, I'll be early.
If anybody wants to log on at 9, you're welcome.
Okay, 9:15 Pacific time. Thank you, Steve.
I'd like to invite you all for drinks later this evening, but clearly that can't happen.
I want to thank our attendees for their dedicated attention, and our panelists for an extraordinary lineup of papers today. So thank you all, and thank you all for this uplifting and really engaging day. And we'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you, everybody.